Hey, what's up everyone? Hope you're all having a great day. So, I'm a bit late to the Season 9 party because I've been away from home for a few weeks, but now that I'm back, I'm hoping to get back to my goal of uploading at least 1 to 2 videos a week. I finally had the chance to try out the new changes, and if you're interested in seeing my initial experience, I live streamed my placements and they're posted on this channel. From what I've heard from other content creators in the community, the changes seem to have been received relatively well in general, with many people finding the game to be an overall improved experience compared to Seasons 1 through 8. That's not to say that the game is perfect now or that everyone agrees with the changes, and there definitely are some concerns in some specific ways, which I'll talk about later, but overall I would agree that the game feels closer to what it quote-unquote should be. To start, let's first talk about the out-of-combat self-healing passive, which was very controversial when it was first announced. I think we can now safely say that the community was very much over-exaggerating the implications of this change, suggesting that it would strip support of its identity and remove a core aspect of Overwatch teamplay. In practice, as expected, I find that the passive is fairly inconsequential the vast majority of the time. In fact, if I hadn't known about the passive, there's a chance I wouldn't have even noticed it until a few games in, and I find myself rarely even trying to actively choose to use the passive in the first place. Many people were speculating that it would allow certain heroes to play much more aggressively and take crazy angles and flanks without needing support, but it turns out that waiting several seconds without doing any damage is almost always a suboptimal play. Most of the time, it's better to just grab a nearby health pack or play closer to your supports. In the context of a teamfight, I don't think the self-healing passive has really made any difference at all, as non-support heroes in general don't really have any value when they're not in line of sight of the enemy. For tanks, I would say that is even less of a consideration as the rate of healing is proportionally very minuscule compared to the health bars of tanks. The one situation where the passive does make a difference is after a teamfight already ends. When a teamfight ends and you find yourself still alive with low HP, it can sometimes feel a bit awkward needing to wait for your supports to come back. The self-healing passive allows you to do something other than hiding from the enemy team, which I think is a good thing as it allows for a cleaner reset for non-support heroes. Of course, I should also mention that another benefit of the healing passive, at least for damage heroes, is that it allows you to more easily play the game when your supports aren't giving you a lot of attention. When it comes to the projectile size increases, the changes were a lot more significant than I first expected. Just looking at the numbers, it didn't seem like that big of a deal, but in-game, the projectile size buff makes a huge difference in how a lot of heroes feel to play. From what I've seen in comment sections and forums, this change in particular has received quite a bit of criticism because it allegedly lowers the mechanical skill of the game. While I can see where this criticism comes from, I don't think it's actually that big of a deal. It's been said that the projectile buffs lower the mechanical skill gap of the game, but I think this is only somewhat true and mostly not true. While certainly a lot of heroes feel more satisfying to play because you get a lot more hit markers, I think in terms of accuracy, every player essentially benefits equally from the larger hitboxes. Larger hitboxes means that you have increased accuracy regardless of your mechanical skill level. If you used to have 15% accuracy, maybe you now have 20%, and if you used to have 30%, maybe now you have 40%. Basically, I think every player, regardless of skill level, benefits proportionally from this change, at least mathematically speaking. Unless you somehow had 100% accuracy before this change. Because of that, although the average accuracies at different skill levels may have changed, the actual skill gap between the skill levels has not. To illustrate, if we sketch a rough graph of mechanical skill versus value, we might imagine something like this: a slope where the better your mechanics are, the more value you're capable of extracting from your hero. If we increase the value uniformly by making hitboxes larger, although the line increases in height, the distance between points on the graph doesn't change, and so really, nobody is better off after the buffs since skill is a relative measurement. This is going to be true for most players, with maybe an exception at the skill floor of a hero, illustrated by the flatter slope on the left side of the graph. To be clear, I'm defining skill floor to mean the minimum skill level required in order to be effective on a hero, which is represented by this line. I've noticed that some players define skill floor to mean the effectiveness of a hero given some arbitrarily minimal amount of skill, which would be represented by this line, and results in a completely different meaning. Using my preferred definition, Moira would be said to have a low mechanical skill floor, whereas using the alternative definition, Moira would be said to have a high mechanical skill floor, which at least to me doesn't sound quite right. The skill floor is the value of the flatter side of the graph on the left, and likewise the skill ceiling would be the point at which the slope ends due to limitations of human ability and/or hero design. The reason a skill floor exists is because in general, most heroes require some minimum level of competency to even begin to be effective. Below that minimum threshold, value increases very little, because so long as you're below that threshold, you can't execute what's required in order to make your hero work well. Once you're able to go beyond that threshold, the skill-to-value ratio increases more steadily. How I think about this is that the projectile size buffs don't really affect most players, but it does affect players who are near the upper end of the skill floor. Effectively, the amount of skill it takes to begin being effective happens earlier, and so if you previously didn't meet the minimum skill requirement to play a hero, the larger hitboxes might now allow you to break through that threshold. And if you happen to be slightly above the threshold, you might feel a bit cheated, since players who previously couldn't compete mechanically are now able to get value because of the reduced mechanical requirements to be effective. This might shake up the meta a bit at various ranks, but for the most part, the gaps between skill levels is the same as it was before. While I do think the projectile size changes do make the game easier in the sense that it lowers the skill floor, I don't think it diminishes the value of mechanical skill in general. My personal opinion is that making the game a bit easier for those without great mechanics can be a good thing for the game, as it makes the game more approachable for newer players. And I don't think reducing the skill floor somehow takes away our ability to appreciate high-level mechanics at the skill ceiling, so long as they don't turn every hero into Moira. An additional benefit to large hitboxes in a game like Overwatch is improved consistency in the behavior of most heroes. Aiming is usually thought of as a purely skill-based thing, but in reality, there's always an element of luck involved. Nobody aims with perfect consistency no matter how good you are, because aiming fundamentally involves predicting the future positioning of a target, which of course, you have no control over. Whether it's tracking or flicking, it takes time to react to the movement of a target, and so the smaller and more evasive a target is, the less likely you'll be able to accurately predict how you should move your crosshair, and this is true regardless of skill. Many hitboxes are very small, and when coupled with the instant acceleration and movement abilities and verticality, aiming can feel very random even if you have excellent mechanics. By increasing hitboxes, it reduces the randomness a bit and makes the game feel more consistent and predictable, which I think is a good thing. A lot of people have said that having larger hitboxes makes the game easier, and while it's certainly easier to get a hit marker, the game itself is not necessarily easier once you account for the global health increases, which we'll talk about next. Higher accuracy means more damage, but more health means higher times to kill, which means that in many cases it's actually harder to get kills in Season 9. Because you have to land more shots, which means you would need significantly better aim if it weren't for the projectile changes. And so my argument is that although you get those satisfying hit markers more often, the game in general isn't actually any easier, at least mechanically speaking. Besides compensating for the larger projectiles, the major motivation for the health buff was to reduce the strength of burst damage. Many players, including myself, had the opinion that one-shots, or really anything that kills you before you have a chance to react, in most cases didn't really belong in the game, even if those one-shot mechanics took skill to execute. The increased HP for all heroes changes the breakpoints of a lot of these quick killing mechanics, and prevents them from assassinating you at full health. The one exception being Widowmaker, who still has a full one-shot at mid-range. The increased health in combination with the projectile size increases means that burst damage is weaker, while sustained damage feels mostly the same. In my opinion, this makes hero interactions feel much more consistent and predictable. Interacting with the enemy team is always going to be necessary, and previously this made engagements with one-shot heroes very frustrating, as the engagements felt like they were decided by coin flips. And this could be true regardless of which side of the engagement you were on. The winner of the engagement was decided by whether the hero with the one-shot was able to land it, and while there absolutely is an element of skill involved, there is always going to be some element of luck, and having an entire engagement decided by a single instance of chance is always going to feel very frustrating. As stated before, the projectile size increase addresses the issues of making engagements feel more consistent, and the health buffs give you an opportunity to respond to quote-unquote lucky shots and find a way to disengage before you die. Perhaps the biggest, most controversial change this season has to be the new DPS anti-heal passive. The passive addresses one of the most common complaints of previous seasons, which was that the game felt too tedious due to the fact that supports were too good at denying plays. Many players blame the problem entirely on certain immortality abilities and so-called burst healing abilities, and while those abilities certainly exacerbated the issue, in my opinion, the primary reason for this problem actually had mostly to do with just the base healing of many supports. Heal botting, although it's never been the best way to play, was very strong because prior to Season 9, healing allowed you to deny most plays that weren't one-shots. And since healing is essentially an unlimited resource, there were very few windows of opportunity to make plays, which took away a lot of what makes Overwatch fun to play, at least in the setting of your average solo queue game. The problem is known as healing creep, and the commonly proposed solution was to simply reduce healing numbers across the board, and the new anti-heal passive is essentially that solution implemented in a more interesting way. Obviously, this change is a direct buff to all damage heroes and an indirect buff to tanks, and mostly a nerf to supports. The passive gives the damage roll significantly more potential to decide the outcome of a game, and by extension takes away some of that potential from supports, which has been blamed as being overpowered for most of Overwatch 2. Having played Season 9 for about 10 hours, I would say that after a year of support-dominated metas, the title of the so-called most impactful role is probably going to the damage role this season. Maybe next year, it'll be the tank role. An additional benefit of the DPS passive I haven't heard anyone else talk about is that it gives the damage role something that actually makes them unique. Damage is something that both the tank and support roles are plenty capable of doing, which means that for the longest time, the damage role has felt like it lacked an identity being on the team, and was only present on the team by obligation of role queue. Part of that feeling was of course because of the out-of-control healing creep in the game, but now in Season 9 with the anti-heal passive, damage heroes finally have something that definitively solidifies their place in the game. The 20% healing reduction coupled with the increased hitbox sizes is just enough to tip the scales in favor of damage over healing, meaning that if a single target is being damaged and healed at the same time, it's now much more likely that the target will actually die. Some players may feel that support sucks now because you can't keep up with damage to keep your team alive. Different players have different opinions about this, but in my opinion, this is actually a good thing. Healing should be used to help your teammates, but it shouldn't make them virtually immortal. Healbotting more in an attempt to make up for the reduced healing is probably a mistake, and now more than ever, the support not healer slogan is an important one to keep in mind. You don't carry your team as a support player by endlessly healing them to keep them alive, because you can't. You keep them alive by helping your team kill the enemies before they can kill your teammates, and healing is only a part of that process. Although the passive is a buff to all damage heroes, it's fairly obvious that it benefits some heroes more than others. In particular, heroes that can apply the passive with a higher uptime like Soldier 76. This means that the DPSs that rely on a more patient playstyle are nerfed indirectly because they can't apply the passive constantly, and so there potentially might need to be some adjustments to compensate for this down the road. How anti-healing affects tanks varies depending on tank design. Tanks also benefit indirectly from the anti-heal passive, but tanks that previously relied on higher healing numbers to enable them can in general feel less viable. And in contrast, tanks that have reliable ways of disengaging can counter the passive more easily. In some ways, this is the same reasoning that made the old Discord orb annoying for tank players. For brawl tanks, while not unplayable, being permanently debuffed without a reliable answer is something that's certainly more difficult to work with unless the map you're playing on naturally favors brawl. And even in those cases, sometimes just playing Sigma might still be better. One of the most common complaints I've heard is that tanks are dying too easily despite the major health buffs, and I think this is both true and not true at the same time, and it has a lot to do with how well you position as a tank player. If you use cover well as a tank, the health buffs are somewhat helpful for survivability, but I think because a lot of tank players are so used to being able to stand far in the open, being enabled by the previously strong healing numbers, that they haven't adapted to the effects of the DPS passive. Although tanks should be tanky, I think it's a good thing that they aren't unkillable when being pocketed. One of the more surprising parts of the patch is that I've seen quite a few bits of optimism coming from the infamous Wrecking Ball community. It turns out that being able to ignore the DPS passive as a result of not being healing reliant means that Ball is able to move his way up the meta. That's not to say that Ball is particularly strong, but I think he's much better than people were initially predicting. Many players were expecting that dive heroes like Tracer and Genji were going to be terrible and that the meta would heavily favor Poke, because the quick get in and get out kills weren't going to be possible with the increased health numbers. Although that is true, I found that dive is actually arguably better than it was in Season 8, as the health buffs now allow dive heroes to stay in the fight and disrupt the backline longer. And the anti-heal passive along with the larger hitboxes allows them to more consistently come out on top. The days of immortal supports pocketing each other are mostly over, which is great news if you play a hero that relies on being able to target the backline. Of course, killing a support is still not easy, but at least it's now more often than not, more possible. Beyond core gameplay changes, I think we also have to talk about the changes to the competitive system in Season 9. I think it's fair to say that the MMR reset is not what most people were expecting, and I think a lot of people were expecting that the start of Season 9 would be similar to starting a new account, and that your placements alone would allow you to reach your previous ranked goals. In reality, your MMR stays roughly the same, and the only thing that really changes is the volatility. meaning that you'll start roughly where you were last season or lower, and each win or loss moves you up or down much further than it would have before. And you'll still have to do quite a bit of grinding even if you assume that you genuinely deserve a higher rank. This seems to be especially true if you were ranked quite highly last season. Having watched a few full-time top 500 streamers, it seems that even for those who were ranked GM1 last season, which would be the equivalent of being champion this season, it can take quite a while to grind back up to that rank. The new competitive 3.0 also addresses one of the biggest complaints about the previous 2.0 system, namely the transparency. With 3.0, Overwatch has effectively gone from being one of the least transparent rank systems ever to potentially being one of the most transparent systems among other competitive games. The new system is essentially what it was in Overwatch 1, at least aesthetically, except instead of using SR, they now use percents. Since Overwatch 1 had 100 SR between each rank, 1% is basically equivalent to 1 SR. To be clear, the ranked algorithm itself hasn't changed from Season 8 to 9, but the information that is available to you has, which is undoubtedly a breath of fresh air for most players. The 3.0 system now not only tells you your precise rank down to a single percent after every game, it also tells you which modifiers are affecting your percent gain or loss, which should be in theory a way to explain to players why they're not gaining or losing the same amount of points every game. To briefly explain the modifiers, they can essentially be put into 3 categories: account volatility, team favoritism, and recent win rates. Your account is more volatile if your account is new, if it has been a while since you've last played ranked, or if the devs have initiated a so-called soft reset like they did for Season 9. If your account is volatile, you gain significantly more for a win, but you also lose significantly more for a loss, allowing you to theoretically move to your real rank faster. Team favoritism is affected by the MMR difference between your team and the enemy team. If your team had a higher MMR, you gain less for a win and lose more for a loss. If your team had a lower MMR, you gain more for a win and lose less for a loss. The last modifier is your recent win rate, and is essentially a sort of momentum on your progress. The higher your recent win rate, the faster you make additional progress, and of course the opposite is true if you have a low win rate. In addition, although you still can't see the individual ranks of players, which is a strategy for mitigating toxicity, you can now see the minimum and maximum rank within your game rather than just the average. I think the ability to simply see your ranked progress in every game is by itself already a big improvement from the 2.0 system, and the added ability to see the modifiers affecting your progress is something that I personally really appreciate. There is one additional major change in Season 9 that I haven't talked about yet, which is the Pharah rework. I'm not a Pharah player, so I don't have too much to say about it, but I've played against Pharah a few times, and the rework was supposed to make her feel less oppressive to play against by limiting her uptime in the air, and it maybe seems to be the case based on my experience so far. Apparently, she's able to be played without a mercy pocket now, and the rework is a net buff to her gameplay, where she's more difficult to play but has a higher skill ceiling. As of now, it does seem like Pharah is less annoying to play with and against, but in my opinion, a flying hero with a rocket launcher in a game where most heroes aren't good at range and where almost every hero can't fly is always going to be annoying. Overall, Season 9 is Overwatch 2's best season so far, at least in my opinion. And I believe that the changes implemented so far, although not perfect, pushes the game in the right direction, and I'm excited to see what the devs are going to do in the future. I think Season 9 finally makes Overwatch 2 worthy of being called a sequel. And that's all I have to say for now. Feel free to let me know your opinion about Season 9. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.